Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
The second thought I had was, I think that, again, this is another strength of Mormonism, is that we're pretty good about holding men and women somewhat equally responsible for sexual chastity, if we want to use that word, right, that religious term. We are not necessarily a culture where it's okay for men to explore and experience while women are expected to stay virginal. That expectation is really placed on both sexes.
Well, that's fair.
Yeah, so it is fair. That doesn't mean that we don't have any gender role issues, because like I mentioned, kind of that victim-perpetrator message that we get. There are definitely differences in how we approach sexuality with women and men in our church, but the expectations are fairly similar. And so I do see a lot of value-driven conversations where boys, in particular, adolescent men, get these messages of respecting women, being aware of issues such as, I don't know if I want to say consent, because I'm not sure we focus a lot on sexual consent, but at least this idea that I don't have the right to just push myself on somebody or expect sexual favors, even though obviously that happens amongst our teens just like it happens anywhere. But at least the messages that I think our adolescent boys are getting are somewhat respectful of girls and vice versa to a certain point. And I see that as a strength. At the same time, I think I just saw a video, a parody of some song that young men were talking about that I think tried to give this message like, oh yeah, it was the song, you're beautiful, something like you're beautiful just the way you are, something along those lines, and then they made their own lyrics to it. With this message trying to tell Mormon girls, hey, you don't have to worry about showing your cleavage to us. Like, we think you're beautiful. We appreciate you. We love you. We think you're great. However, there was a sense of patriarchal creepiness in it. In a sense was kind of like, we need your modesty. It's not just that we think you're beautiful the way you are. It's this expectation that you better not show us too much, because if you do, then we have a problem.
Yeah.
And so does that make sense? So Mormons kind of have this complicated way of I think having good sexual values that then culturally go awry really badly and mess things up in some complicated ways, unfortunately.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, it sounds in some ways very similar to in Islamic societies where women have to cover, the hijab. Because if there's any exposed flesh, it may set off arousal in men, and then they won't be able to stay on track with what they're supposed to be doing as men, and they'll be distracted. So, I hear even something kind of similar in that's, we need these women to be modest so that we can control ourselves.
And then not understanding how that is equally objectifying.
Oh, absolutely. In some ways, it's because it's kind of, insidious and hidden, it can, I think, be even sort of deeper in terms of having that effect. Because people don't even realize that they're digging this hole for themselves. But that's, again, you mentioned before, that's that sort of patriarchal structure that, in a sense, that kind of oppression of women by keeping them in this sort of fragile, almost that kind of deified way that women are sort of not to be related to in a certain way. There's a role. We cherish that role. We hold them in this regard. We have to protect them. Now, where is there in that room for women's sexuality?
Yeah, and where is that for the woman, the empowered woman in the porn video? That's certainly not the mousy, chaste little woman at home. So there must be something, more judgment, more morality about the wanton woman.
Right.
This stuff runs deep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which and that's also, you mentioned before, these attitudes, are millennia old. Right? I mean, again, when you look at even the name of the body for women, the vulva that used to be referred to as pudendum, something to be ashamed of. That goes back a couple of thousand years. Right? So, again, we're maintaining a lot of these legacies, but I think it's taking things to a different level when we now sort of add the porn factor into the mix, because I think what it does is both reinforce these types of messages, and I think reinforces a lot of the confusion and the fear that people, especially men, feel in terms of their own perceived adequacy.
Well, your comment made my vulva sad.
I'm sorry. What can I do to make your vulva smile?
I guess we can go into males feeling inadequate, although that's sad too.
Well, I was going to say you can't masturbate because that's disturbing or defiling with the hands.
Right.
So we mustn't have any of that. No, I don't mean to make light, because I know that these are really, well, that's why educators talk about values all the time, and why it's a difficult line to not cross. We hear people talking all the time about meeting someone where they're at, but what if where they're at is messed up and adding to their problems? How do we meet someone where they're at and still be bold enough to offer an alternative view to usually them putting their own burdens and obstacles in their own way? Guilt, I think, is a choice, and all sexuality educators, I think, at some point have to deal with the accusation of being disrespectful to religious communities. Come on, don't be crazy. Of course you should be masturbating. Everybody's doing it. This, like Barbara Streisand in Meet the Fockers. No, I think sex ed can be very spiritually based. A lot of the original sex educators were doing it in the context of faith communities. But we can certainly invite more of a healthy relationship with oneself, and start the discussion with pleasure. Anything from, twirling one's hair or chewing on fingers as a way of grounding oneself in body pleasure. And it's part of that healthy relationship with sexuality.
Healthy relationship with one's body. To be able to see one's body as a source of pleasure as opposed to shame and embarrassment. I mean, I think that's a big shift for a lot of people. To be honest with you, that's one of the ironies of faith that a lot of people maintain that I've never quite understood. On the one hand, if you believe we are created in the image of this divine, perfect being, then how can we consider any part of this body to be dirty, bad, or shameful in any way?
Amen.
Those incompatible thoughts.
Right.
Yet that's kind of the conflict a lot of people sort of live in with all of that. So, even just if we just sort of, and again, I hate to overuse the word normalize, but to, normalize that the body is a vessel of pleasure. It is meant to allow us to feel good and to share these things. But it also means that we have to be responsible for it. And we've got to be conscious of what we're doing. And I think that's part of what that foundation of what we can teach young people about porn in particular can be set around. Right? Again, like Ricky said before, we cannot avoid it. We cannot try to pretend that it's not out there and that we can keep them away from it. I think we need to equip them to deal with it, to manage it, to not make it a detrimental part of their lives. Right? And you were saying earlier as well, Natasha, that to say that porn is not the problem people try to make it out to be is not to say that there are no problems associated with porn, especially for young people. And I think, we do need to be aware of some of these implications and deal with them directly. I do believe that especially when kids really involve themselves with porn fairly young, it becomes what they learn about relationships. It becomes what they learn about each other. Right? I do think that there is a relationship to negative attitudes toward women, maybe more of a tolerance toward mistreatment of women. Rape, sexual violence, no, I don't. In fact, there is data on that around the world. I wish I remember the particular study off the top of my head, but there's actually been a couple of studies that show since the availability of porn the way we have it right now, really going back to the late 90s, the period of time where porn was freely accessible and available the way it is right now, rates of sexual violence have decreased across the board. Rates of sexual violence among adolescents, and especially adolescent girls, have decreased significantly. The rate of adolescent sexual activity in general has decreased. So again, not to say that there aren't any problems associated with it, but these nightmares that parents have about what porn is going to do to their kids doesn't really seem to be true. Now, again, that's not to say there aren't concerns that we should have. And I think most of those concerns are about, what young people are gleaning from what they're seeing, what they're learning.
Can you get a little bit more specific about what you mean by, well, both relational issues that they're gleaning from that, and also maybe you had mentioned briefly sexual inadequacies of young men?
Mm-hmm. A lot of men, again, the reinforcement of some of that by looking at, whether it's the size of an actor's penis, the amount of ejaculate he releases. But most guys don't realize that there's a reason that this is what these men do for a living. Right? They're kind of specially selected, if you will, for these kinds of things. Most men do not have 9-inch penises, and they do not ejaculate by the bucket load. So by guys not knowing that this isn't normal, they're comparing themselves to what they're seeing. Guys that are lasting a long time, an inordinately long time, they don't understand that there's a lot of cutting in those scenes, and there's a lot of breaks, and there's a lot of help that this guy has to have.
There's a lot of Viagra and shots being used
absolutely.
As well.
And people whose job it is specifically to help men maintain an erection. They don't see the behind the scenes. Right? So I think that's part of educating them that this is a fantasy. This is all created and structured, and it's meant to basically arouse men.
Yeah, and I think some of the other body image issues that we see, obviously there's very little pubic hair or any type of hair, chest hair, etc. There's, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the body image issues that women face?
Oh, again, women, and first of all, if men are experiencing body issues and those types of inadequacies from watching porn, then I think it's a safe bet that girls are as well, if not even more so. Right? Because, and again, Ricky, I think you mentioned, or at least alluded to this earlier, that, go back into the 70s and the 60s, porn was considered sleazy. I don't want to be catty or nasty, but by most common standards, porn actresses and actors were not the most attractive people. And they didn't need to be, because it wasn't like a regular movie where that was a factor. Here it was just the graphic sex was the factor. So you didn't really, first of all, a lot of women were not even bothering and looking at porn. But those that did, including the guys, there was a clear separation. It was easier to see that this was fantasy, we're enjoying this, I'm not a part of it. In fact, back then, just television in general was sort of easier to separate from. Now these are people that are considered very attractive. They're hot. They're both men and women want to be like them. There's something that's attractive to them now, and there's no more separation between whether it's television or anything on a screen, especially now a computer, and what used to be considered real life. So now there's almost this immersion in these things, and I think they're getting lost. It's like, how did I get here, and how do I get out?
Can you expand on that? What do you mean getting lost?
Meaning that they're really end up seeing nothing but this is how I'm supposed to behave. This is what is expected of me. And again, we were talking earlier about that Australian study that talking about girls who feel pressure. Right? The majority of girls in this Australian study feeling pressure to sext, to send naked pictures of themselves. And I would have to expect that they feel equal pressure in real life to fulfill the sexual needs of the adolescent males that they're exposed to. And I think there's a sense of, I don't know anything else, so this is what it's supposed to be, but I don't really like this, so how do I deal with this? And that's what I mean by the getting lost in it.
Yeah, so inauthentically going forward with things that feel expected versus creating that sense of sexual and sensual values that feel authentic to oneself.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, a big part of the role as parents is instead of inflicting just another pressure system, right? So a lot of people say, well, okay, the porn industry is, in a sense, inflicting all of these pressures on our kids, but then they substitute that with this religious system that also inflicts a lot of pressure system to the kids, right? Instead of helping those kids develop their own sense of ownership around their bodies, around their sexuality, around their sexual decisions. Obviously, values can be part of that discussion, but I think we fail to understand how substituting one pressure system for another doesn't necessarily help anybody become more empowered to make sexual decisions.
I agree. Now, I will take issue, however, with I think the characterization of it, porn pressuring people into doing that. I don't know that there really is. There may be certainly implicit pressure that people feel, but I don't think there's any sense of, at least intentionally, putting them out as a standard, basically porn being a standard with an expectation of people to follow the way we see with the religious pressure. But I do think there is implicit pressure to have to meet a certain unrealistic standard of attraction and performance. And I think that's kind of gotten to be almost equal between males and females, especially adolescents.
Okay. So just to keep on going down this road, I mean, some of the themes I see are, one thing that seems very popular in most erotic films is this idea that when the man ejaculates, that somehow that is happening outside of the female body, that we see the ejaculation happen. And granted, some people like that or have all kinds of different types of sex, but it seems like every single time that is what's happening in pornography.
Yes, in the porn industry, that's always been called the money shot. And that was the one way to prove that what they were showing was real. It wasn't simulated intercourse. They were really having intercourse. So the close-up of the penis moving in and out of the vagina wasn't enough to convince you of that. So the fact that the male is actually seen ejaculating is really the money shot, the one that makes it all, is the literal climax of the scene. And that's been a production item.
Yeah.
That then has crossed over into mainstream behavior.
And there's a whole other discussion that probably gets most guys uncomfortable, and that is why guys get off on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not some closet gay fear. It's just that there's really no other way besides moaning and squirming. There's really no other way for a guy to relate to what a woman is experiencing in that scene. So if the other guy pulls out and ejaculates on her, he kind of, I get that. I know what that feels like, and that's what he's relating to.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if I can also throw in an even older, underlying script that goes back to what you were even saying before, Natasha, that there's also an element of domination and control involved in that. There's something inherently degrading about being ejaculated on.
Yeah.
Which is why it's always the passive partner. Even in a lot of gay porn, when you have the person who's in the more dominant position, the top, you will not have them generally switching positions. If the one that's in the dominant position, he will ejaculate on his partner, but the partner will not ejaculate on him. It's a one-way kind of thing because it's about dominance. The Japanese, and their sort of, some of their cultural fetishes for years have had that practice of bukkake, which is almost in many cases a ritual where groups of men will circle a woman. And in more ancient times, the woman was buried in the ground. And these guys up to her neck. And these guys would basically circle her and basically pleasure themselves until they all ejaculate on her. So this is not anything new, but the fact that it crossed from porn to mainstream, just like pubic hair shaving, just like body hair shaving in general. Why do men shave their pubic hair?
Piercings, tongue piercings.
Yeah,
it's always been funny over the years to see these embarrassed little high school girls sitting in class and clicking their tongue piercing on their teeth, and you point it out. Oh, you got a tongue piercing there? What's that for? And, again, when it's kind of a fashion trend for little 13-year-old virgins, and then you start talking about, well, where that comes from, don't you? And there's another conversation to be had about sexual aids and sort of pornified things getting mainstream.
Meaning it's a tool for oral sex.
Sure.
Right.
But I wanted to say that I'm really looking forward to reading, and sorry that we didn't have a chance to read it before this conversation tonight, but David Lay's new book, Ethical Porn for Dicks. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that yet, Natasha.
It is ordered.
Yeah.
Not had a chance to read it yet. I know there's also Girls and Sex by Peggy Ornstein. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, but that talks a lot about the issues that she, I think, as a journalist, has gone around the country talking to college-age girls and high school girls about many of these types of issues, and comes to similar conclusions. I think, again, we think, well, yeah, look at the information our young people are giving us. Porn is a health crisis, right? And we have to get away from all of this, instead of really understanding that there's no way to get beyond erotic material. It has existed since the beginning of humankind. Like you're mentioning, cave dwellings have porn in them, and if you want to call it that. And so it's really more about educating and empowering our youth and our single young adults with information and decision-making skills, and helping them understand that these cultural pressures or cultural messages come from a long history, and even normalizing, like when you say the dominant submissive positions, that those also are eroticized. So you can be a feminist and empowered and feel very good about yourself and be highly aroused that your partner is ejaculating in your face, for example. Whereas another woman might find that extremely offensive. So again, erotic tastes differ, and how we eroticize and deal with the cultural information that has been around us environmentally for all of our lives is interpreted differently by our erotic minds, and it becomes our erotic template.
And once again, you encapsulated it beautifully.
Yes, indeed.
Right? I think there's a parallel, because I also want to throw in that, one of the keys, and in addition to what you were just saying, is also being honest. We have a tendency, and I think it's very dishonest, and I know where it's coming from, but it's still dishonest when all we're telling them about is the dangers of porn, what it's going to do to them, the horrible things. Because, the parallel that I would make is, especially early on when we started doing HIV and AIDS education. that you have all these people that would do this fire and brimstone, doom and gloom. If you have unprotected sex, you're going to get this and you're going to die. And then what happened when, all of these young people especially ended up having unprotected intercourse, and as scared as they may have been that night, they wake up the next morning and the sun is still shining and the birds are still singing. And at that moment, they realize that the person that just told them all of that stuff cannot be trusted again. We will not listen to them anymore because they lied to us. So I think if we want to really be able to reach and have these discussions with young people, we have to be honest. And part of that is not only is this wide range of erotic desire and pleasure and arousal, but you should not feel ashamed if you enjoy porn, and you should not feel ashamed if you don't. Right? If you do, and this is where I think the proverbial rubber hits the road for a lot of parents. How much do we really mean when we say we are willing to get our hands dirty to keep our kids safe? Are we willing to give kids permission? Right? If they're watching porn, if you see porn in the browser of your son or daughter's computer, is there any aspect of that where you might consider telling them it's okay for them to do that, as long as it's not interfering with their lives, as long as they have a healthy relationship with it and there's a good context for it?
He gets such good grades.
Right? So a little porn may not be a bad thing, right? As long as it keeps good grades, right?
Right.
But are we willing to be honest when it comes
and this is where
to sexuality?
I think that whether it's masturbation or pornography or any type of sexuality prior to marriage, again, because that's the standard of that the religion has set, it's very difficult for parents to take that type of self-authority and offer options that would be seen as other than worthy, right? Religiously worthy. And
Right.
I get that. I mean, that's a very, very difficult balancing act, especially when everything in your culture is telling you very opposite things from maybe what we're saying on programs like this.
Sure. Right. But I think if we make it about values and not control, we might be more successful. Right. So you can tell your child what you would like to see, what you expect, what your faith expects, what we would like to see, what we feel about it, what we believe, but also acknowledge that some people also believe a little bit differently, and some people feel that this. I mean, you can give them both sides of it, and then say, "And we, trust you to make the right decision." Because the more we try to force it, again, as we mentioned before, the more we're just going to drive it underground and behind our backs, and then we have no chance of, I don't want to say controlling it, but connecting with it and helping to guide.
Probably only the Mormons will get this, but this would actually be following Heavenly Father's parenting plan instead of Satan's, meaning that Heavenly Father in Mormon doctrine is allowing us to make our own decisions, is allowing us to experience and use our own capacities to make these types of decisions, whereas Mormon theology, Satan was the one who came up with the plan that everybody will just do it the way it's prescribed so that everybody gets saved. So it's an interesting dilemma in Mormon parenting, because the plan that we believe in, that Heavenly Parents are using with us, is not usually the plan we're most comfortable with our own kids.
Yeah. That does kind of put another wrinkle into it. So that there's no real wiggle room, right? But just from again, I think in an effectiveness standpoint, there's some point that this is what we want. But there has to be some acknowledgement that they're going to make their own decisions when we're not around, equipping them and, offering them the trust, whether that's with and God trusts you to make the right decision as well. Oh, and Heavenly Father is watching you, so, make sure you do the right thing. If that's a part of it, that's fine as well. But there's still some, but you have to make your own decision.
Well, and understanding, I think, too, that it is cruel for us to set it up in a way where the only way to stay safe is to choose the value system of the parent. And by that, I mean, avoiding vaccines that are necessary to avoid certain STIs that can cause cancer, avoiding any talk about birth control, avoiding any talk about pornography, which then can affect relational issues down the road. So assuming that your child, the only way that your child can achieve healthy sexuality is to follow your value system and provide zero ability to do anything else, really puts your child at relational and even health risks, unwanted pregnancy risks, etc., that can have lifelong effects just because we're too stubborn as parents to budge from our own comfort zones and our own values and morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to revisit really quickly, I should have brought this up in the body image issues, but there is a rise of plastic surgery for vulvas.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yes, there's labioplasty.
Design a vagina.
Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly fits in with the theme, and a lot of people think that it's also that desire to look like a 12-year-old porn star. Again, I think it's easy to see why some people would blame the porn industry for creating that standard. Well, just another standard that women feel pressured to live up to from men.
The body image thing, they're thinking that their vagina is supposed to look a certain way, or their vulva is supposed to look a certain way, just like their breast is supposed to look a certain way, because in addition to these cosmetic restructuring of the labia that a lot, more younger girls are doing, so is breast enlargement. Younger girls are getting breast jobs done. Some are getting more facelifts done. We see adolescent and guys in their young, early 20s getting collagen injections into their penis to make it look bigger, or having this tendon cut so that the penis can maybe extend an extra quarter of an inch.
Oh my goodness.
They're shocked to find out that it's not stable and basically can't really do a whole lot with it anymore. But I think these are influences, and these are some of those implicit pressures that you're mentioning earlier.
Yeah, so does it come from the porn, or is the porn just reflecting the culture? Kind of like when they used to blame rock music lyrics for kids committing suicide or worshiping Satan.
Right. Yeah. Was it Ozzy Osbourne, or was it the fact that you never talk to your kid as a parent? So it's, these they are perceived, whether they're put out there as or not, they are sort of perceived as standards that a lot of adolescent girls feel they're supposed to live up to. Now, I think what drives that standard is less about the looks of the actresses in those porn videos than it is the response by the males. So I don't know that it's so much they want to, I even said before, they want to aspire to be porn stars. Maybe not so much to be porn stars, but to be that attractive to and have that kind of effect on men.
Yeah, which sets, I think, both men and women up for performance-type sex instead of pleasure-centered sex, and trying to portray yourself in a certain way that's going to be about the other person instead of a mutual experience.
Which is an important theme as well, that what they see in porn is not pleasure-based, it's strictly a performance and not a real one.
Sex therapists said performance problems are as big an issue for men as they are for women, and self-consciousness and body image, and just another reason for not being present and connected during sex. And if talking about porn is another way to help folks address those problems and help them to feel more connected during sex, then perhaps there'd be less conflict in the relationship over porn.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up this idea of youthfulness, which again is millennia old, right? That youthful women have always been, in particular, more sought after or more valued. And to the point that, the vulva and that entire genital region is portrayed to look like a prepubescent child,
Mm-hmm.
which is fascinating to me, that we would find that erotic when that's not really how we're wired. Removal of pubic hair, which is a sign of adulthood. The labia is usually very tucked, and you don't see a lot of variety of labia like you would in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And these are things that I think, again, for both men and women, if parents can be talking to their sons and say, if you have a sexual experience with an equal age partner, whether they're 16 or 20 or whatever they are, that, yeah, you're going to come across things that you're not seeing in pornography. Her labia may look differently than what you're used to. She may have pubic hair. He may not have an erection that looks exactly like you've seen. There's people who are uncircumcised, for example. So that you're preparing your adolescent or your young adult child to be a graceful and charitable lover versus a judgmental, shocked partner that then implicitly shames the other person, because now all of a sudden you're gasping when you go down on her or him because you're not seeing what you thought you would see.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or feel shame because they don't like it as much as they thought they were supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and again, there's a lot. That's that reinforcement of confusion, of shame, of making these comparisons. So and again, is it any different than magazine ads, fashion, commercials in general, movies in general? I have to say no, and I think this is where we have to make a big shift as well and get off this obsession with porn and see this more as more general societal messages that have no substance to counteract them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because there's no less body image issue that is experienced with porn than there is in reading Vogue. That context, it's basically porn is just another vehicle for producing unrealistic expectations and promoting unrealistic images of what the body is supposed to be like.
Is there any truth to what I recently heard, that the removal of pubic hair actually increases chances for STIs?
Not really.
Well,
I mean,
herpes.
yeah, I was gonna say
I
maybe
heard
a contact.
if the skin is more irritated, and I also heard a nurse practitioner we know, practitioner, said that there may be a problem in some
HPV.
places with herpes or HPV being spread from wax if it's not changed or if implements are not cleaned well. But I would think just the irritation from waxing or shaving could make one more susceptible.
Yeah, they have, again, something like that. I mean, if the skin is intact, then no, not really. Again, maybe with the exception of herpes, but hair isn't much of a protective barrier.
Okay.
Yeah, in and of itself, I would say not really.
Okay, so I've kept you way too long, as usual. I just can't stop talking to you both. I like it. So let's wrap up with, I guess, I think I've covered most of what was in my brain as far as issues that I think parents should be at least addressing or bringing up with their kids as they have conversations around pornography, sexual expectations, sexual values, sexual health, protective measures, etc. What am I leaving out? Is there anything that you feel like I haven't touched on that you want to make sure we do touch on?
I think that pretty well covers, I think, most of it.
Well, then the next question, or I guess invitation, is for both of you to give me your closing thoughts as far as what you would hope people gained from this podcast, what you would hope we would be very adamant about educating our teens on, especially as parents and leaders and community peoples.
Well, I think I would just say, it's my bias as a sexuality educator. I think both of us kind of trained with this idea of teachable moments as the guiding principle, that anything that presents a chance, even if it's, all the better if it's possibly uncomfortable, to get those conversations happening in the car on the way to school. It's always a safe way to approach it. Like, what do you think your friends at school are doing? We certainly don't recommend back tightening kinds of interrogations, sitting a kid down and saying, "Are you looking at porn?" But, instead talking about, what do your friends talk about at school? Does anybody, bring up these conversations? And I think the best thing a parent can do for their kid is appear human and maybe a little nervous about a certain conversation, but a willingness to go there anyway and look things up together. I think, when people think of the internet and they think of porn, we forget that there's tremendous, tremendous resources for really good sex ed. I want to plug our friend Paul Joannides' website, theguidetogettingiton.com, where it's kind of an online encyclopedia based on his famous book by the same name, where particularly adolescent boys, but anybody can just get a little nugget of information every day or every week and feel a little bit less stigmatized against seeking sexual health information and not equating sex in the computer with porn and vice and bad habits, but a source of sexual health.
Mm-hmm. One of the things too, I would also recommend, especially for parents, that a good place to have what might be uncomfortable or difficult conversations is in the car. You got to realize you have a captive audience; they can't really get away. So that's often a good time to maybe throw some of these things out there. And again, like Ricky said, asking, what are your friends talking about? What are they talking about in school? I would even recommend asking outright. Maybe couching it a little bit. That this seems to be, people talk a lot about porn. It seems to be everywhere. Have you ever looked at porn? And to again, give permission. Say it's really okay. But I think in order to be able to even start a conversation with your kid, as parents, we need to understand that porn is not a crisis. If you see porn in your browser history on the computer or your kid's computer, it is not a crisis. Don't go into this, end of the world. Our kid's going to be a pervert. Our kid's never going to be able to have a relationship. Our kid's going to be a sexual deviant. It's going to ruin them. Get rid of all of that and just see it as something you need to have a good conversation with your child about. No shaming, no catastrophizing, if possible, with very little judgment, especially related to them. In other words, it's okay. There are a lot of people that find that stimulating. There are a lot of people to enjoy that kind of thing. Even if maybe you find gay porn on your son's site or on your daughter's site, don't go rush to the conclusion, first of all, that your child is gay and that's a calamity in and of itself. Again, it's just an opportunity to have a discussion, to see where they're at. Right? Don't assume that they're going to think the same way we do about it. And that's what a lot of parents do. They have their attitudes. They have all of their baggage around, all the sexual things that they have. So when they see something in their kids, they're projecting their own stuff onto their kids. So listen. A good conversation involves a lot of listening, right? Especially with your kid, and giving them a voice and giving them a safe opportunity to talk honestly and openly to you. I'm hard pressed to see that as anything other than a gift. So, we want to let them know that this is out there. This is part of the world. We cannot avoid that. If they do or if they don't, there doesn't have to be any shame involved. And like I said, I think it's also helpful to teach them that there is an appropriate and even a healthy place that porn could play in their lives. but we have to understand it, and we have to know where that does fit in and not replacing anything with it. Understanding that this is not what we learn about relationships. And again, all those other things that we talked about, bringing out to the surface for them to allow them to understand. Right? I think parents often forget that the point behind having these conversations is to educate and communicate, not to punish and shame.
I know that this is a quick little jaunt, I guess, that I'll take you on if you agree to stay a little tiny bit longer. But I know that when we talk about the possibility of porn playing a healthy role, that will probably not sit well with a lot of my audience. Is there an ability to share a few minutes of what that might look like, or what types of positive players this can have in a person's life?
You're right. I mean, it's that sticky wicket again, that in the context of Mormonism, there really isn't any wiggle room. But what I would consider a positive or healthy place is one where they're able to enjoy it for what it is. And I would actually make a distinction between enjoying versus emulating. If they're emulating this and they're seeing this as something they're supposed to be, learning from, that's not a healthy relationship, or I think a positive place. If it's something that they can detach from, see it as something that they may find entertaining, arousing, even gratifying, but it's not who they are. It's not a part of them. It's really something that they're doing. If they can keep that separation, then knowing that they're not going to do this in place of things that they're supposed to be doing, right? Not cutting school so that they can spend time with porn, not foregoing some of their normal activities because they would rather stay by themselves watching porn. I think if it's something they do alone, that's different than something that they do in isolation. So I think, to me, these are some of those, those distinctions that can keep it more a positive place. But it's a perspective thing. I mean, some would say that there's no way to positively use an illegal drug. But some people do so recreationally. Now, we may not agree with that, but the reality is some people do, and that's a choice they make. And if that's their choice, there's ways of keeping it healthy and positive and avoiding some of those detrimental effects. But that's one of those, you're not supposed to do it, but if you do, here's a way that you can keep safe. And I know for a lot of parents that's hypocritical, but it's, I think, realistic.
Right. Okay.
I mean, we know there's examples of, there's times when maybe porn can be helpful to a couple in sex therapy, but I can't imagine a scenario where a sex therapist would be, pushing, saying, come on, I know you have your religious beliefs, but this is important, right? Plenty of interventions where, first, we're always encouraging people to log on to more fantasy in their minds instead of on the computer anyway. So I can't imagine it being a problem where someone might have to seek special dispensation from a member of their clergy to get permission to look at porn for fixing some sexual dysfunction. Like, for example, somebody might need permission to self-pleasure to treat like rapid ejaculation or something like that, but even in that case, it's not like mandatory, whereas someone has to make a choice between their value system and getting past a sexual problem.
Yes, there is what we're supposed to do, but in reality, we know that people do what they need to do sometimes. Right? So, we know what the teachings are and what this says about relationships and sex and porn and what we're supposed to say to our kids and what we're supposed to talk about and think about with this stuff. Yet when it comes down to the actual doing, maybe, well, I may need to say this or I may need to do that. I'm not sure if I can articulate this well, but there's a lot of people in their sort of religious practice that there's the rhetoric, and then kind of behind closed doors, there's, what they actually do. Supposed to do and what they actually do aren't always the same.
Right. And Mormonism does have a space for this because we do believe in this idea of personal revelation. And so there's general guidance for the general population. And there's also our own ability to claim our own authority and decide what is best for our specific situations. Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's the space in which to operate, to follow the principles and teaching do you're supposed to do, but maybe there's that little wiggle room to make it work.
And this in particular, I think, is very applicable when you have kiddos who maybe have certain mental health diagnoses. If you've got a bipolar older teenager in your home, for example, that's going to be a very different parenting experience than something else. And you may have to have very different types of approaches towards that kid's sexuality than you would your other kiddos.
Most definitely. And that sounds like a great topic for another podcast.
All right. And then I guess what I would add, just as my last few thoughts, is I am so glad you talked about not shaming and punishing kids. I think oftentimes what Mormon parents do in these situations where they find out that their kid is looking at porn is that they get dragged into the bishop's office, and now this becomes a more disciplinary focused event, or this is how kids oftentimes get put into these addiction treatment centers or programs, and the whole thing becomes very, very shaming, very embarrassing. An aspect of your child's privacy and sexual development is now quite public. And their sense of self-esteem and self-identity as a sexual being gets really kind of put off the rails in ways that then, of course, keeps me in business, but I'd rather not have to be in business for that reason. And so I think that's a really, really good advice. And the other thing I think, with your ideas of having these car conversations, it's looking at it as eating the elephant through bite-sized pieces, right? And so it's an ongoing process.
Definitely.
Don't listen to this podcast and write all the main points down and have a 3-hour conversation where you cover each certain one.
Absolutely. It's not a conversation. It is a process.
Right. So take opportunities to maybe write down some notes and see, over the next 6 months, I'd like to cover a variety of these topics, for example. And I think it's also really great when parents can say things like, I don't know, or use humor, or in a sense, own up to their own discomfort. Like, oh, I want to talk to you about this, and yet I notice my own anxiety coming up, and I think kids can really appreciate the honesty of the difficulty for all of us.
Especially in the context of, but you are so important that I'm willing to work through this.
Yeah.
Much as it's difficult and it bothers me, it's important enough. You're important enough for me to do it anyway.
Exactly.
That's a gift.
Yeah. And kids, they're usually the hypocrisy police. They know we're nervous anyway, so might as well just own it and just say, this is hard. So I don't know if I'm doing this right.
You think you don't want to have this conversation. I don't want to have it either.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time, Ricky, Larry. Thank you so much. This has been
it's such a pleasure.
It's such a treat to have you on, and you just bring so much knowledge and just experience, and also just very frank conversations that I think are really important for us to listen to.
Thank you, and again, we have so much appreciation for what you're doing, and I think your audience is very, very lucky to have you doing what you're doing.
Oh, thank you very much.
took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise, can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.